the most important day for me to be there, and I could, so I was very thankful. Well, I think we will get started. Let me just remind you before I mute everybody that you probably see the transcription rolling across the bottom of your screen. I'm hoping that that is a good assist for you. If you choose not to use it, if you go to where it says live transcript or CC, you can hide the subtitles. That's what you want to click on if you want them hidden, or to have them showing if you want them showing. Like I said, on Friday night, with forgiveness, not mine to ask, but forgiveness for the little person who is writing the transcription, who means well, but who doesn't have much capacity for either accents or foreign languages. So it gives us the best that we can, and provides another level of access. Hi everybody. Hi everybody. So just a word about transcription, and also I'll mention at the beginning of class and then again at the end of the class, because we have one to make up. There's no way to cover Maimonides. There is no way to cover Maimonides in 40 classes. He is such a prolific writer and thinker that we could never do it. It was not short-sighted or cruel to offer a four-session teaser to Maimonides, but my hope is that we'll be able to dive much more. Maybe next year when we're back. It's really meant to be when we're sitting at a table together and looking at his actual physical work. It's so dense. So today is our third, but actually meant to be our fourth class. So I'm looking ahead to see and invite you please just to take a quick peek to see. We can't meet next Monday because that's Shavuot and Yisker, so we can't meet next Monday, but I can't meet the following Monday. So I wonder if you'll take a peek, and then I'll ask again at the end, if Wednesday the 19th is a possibility at noontime for people. Okay, and you can just put in the chat if that works for you, for the fourth and final class of Maimonides. So that would be 5:19. If it works, just put a yay or nay in the text box, in the chat box, and I'll collect them at the end. And then we'll do a bit of a look to see if that's good for enough folks. We'll go forward. If not, we'll do another date.
What are you trying to do?
Did you say the same time?
Same time, noon. Yeah, noon. So just we can check that out and as a potential, okay? Because Monday's not an option. Any questions before we get started? I'm looking around. I think everybody was here last week. Yes.
Oh, Wednesday is not. The 19th of June is not. It was not a Wednesday.
Wednesday. May.
May.
Is it not the 19th? Sorry, do I have the wrong date?
In June. Okay.
May 19th. No. May 19th. We're in May, right? So today's May 10th. So it would be a week and 2 days from today. Just before I mute everybody, does anybody have any questions from last week? We looked just at on a very shot level, right? So those of you who have done some study, some text study, know that there are different levels on which we study our primary texts, our biblical texts, and then all of our sacred texts after that. And the shot level is the surface, imagining that we're looking at it as the surface of the water, right? And appreciating, the beauty of the surface of the water. That's how we're looking at Maimonides, and then some, maybe even above the water, right? Just kind of seeing just from a very cursory look. And then there are so many levels below, as we know, of any of us who have done, scuba diving or snorkeling, right? Even just kind of when you go under the water, one layer, you see so much different. And then when you dive even deeper, you get to see so much more across the floor of the water, right? So too it is with our sacred text. We are just barely at the surface level with Maimonides. So the very first week, which seems like eons ago, I gave you an overview of Maimonides. Then last week we looked just at his Mishnah Torah, his first work, and then today we're going to look at the Guide to the Perplexed. So Guide for the Perplexed. So before we go on, any initial residual questions from last week? Then I'm gonna mute everybody and invite you please to unmute yourself if you have a question and I don't see you, or if there's another need and you can't get it into the chat box fast enough, okay? So we will, just by way of quick review. Everybody should be able to see that, yes? Okay. Same guy that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks, right? Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. That's an acronym for his name. Those are his dates we see, right? This is where we are today, looking at the Guide for the Perplexed. It's on this column. It is his next significant, is an understatement if ever there was one, for his work. Written over the span of 15 years, and interestingly, it is written in Arabic characters, right? It is written in Arabic characters, but with Hebrew context, right? Which is, when you study people like Rashi, when you're studying Talmud and you read the commentaries in the Mishnah and the Gemara, it's so confusing to read in Hebrew characters, or in the Rashi script. He had developed his own script to read in French. Right, so there's a whole kind of other piece, a nuanced piece that we can't even grab in the same way, because it's a translation of a translation, almost of a translation, as we're reading it. So here is where we're looking at the Guide to the Perplexed, where the Mishnah Torah, we talked about Mishnah Torah, really is a detailed look of the Mishnah, much more halachic in context and legal. The Guide for the Perplexed, or the Guide to the Perplexed, depending on who's presenting it, is much more esoteric, philosophical, and based in thought, and thought less so. It's predicated on a basic understanding of the law, not basic, but an understanding of Jewish law and Jewish primary texts, Torah in particular, and then Talmud. But then goes on and does a much deeper dive, not just under the surface of the water, but really down to the bottom level of the ocean floor, to really truly examine how it could possibly all be. He is tremendously influenced, we know, by Aristotle. That is who's got the most sway over his work. And here's just a little bit more from today's class. Can everybody see okay? You can see the text. You can increase the size of your text by your view options, okay? So in English, it's called the Guide for the Perplexed. In Hebrew, Moreh Nevuchim. Like I say, it's written in Arabic and translated into Hebrew, and really it is his examination of the questions of theology and philosophy and life and good and evil. And we're going to look more, at all of his different categories. Did the universe have a beginning? Will it ever end? What, reward and punishment? How does it all fit together? And interestingly, where it comes from, where this writing comes from. So where he wrote very legally from Mishnah, here he writes from a very philosophical level, and where it comes from, what the impetus was for this piece of writing. Piece actually sounds diminutive and ought not to. This tome of writing is actually from a student who he had. His name was Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Aknin. He was, as you see there, he was one of his most unlikely students. He had a voracious appetite for learning and speculative matters. And Rambam actually said to him, before we can do this deeper dive together, I want you to study astronomy and math and science. And really not like kind of Hillel and Hillel and Shammai with the prospective convert who said, one said, go away and prove to me that you're really interested in studying, and the other one said, come and study. Really, Rambam was both a rational and critical thinker and a philosopher and a lover of Jewish texts. And he wanted to make sure that this student had all the foundations, not just the Jewish foundations, but that he could engage in thorough and comprehensive thinking, the way math and science and astronomy require someone to be a thinker. So he had him study all these texts to prepare him most especially to look at the Ezekiel narrative. And really that's kind of in part at the heart of one of the chapters of the Guide for the Perplexed, which very few can understand. I don't know how many of you have ever studied the book of Ezekiel? Show me with a raise of hand. Has anybody studied the book of Ezekiel? Nobody? So I want to tell you that most people who at this point, who in a progressive setting, who look at the book of Ezekiel, all allegory, all metaphor, so complex, so difficult to wade through. And you know the name Ezekiel, right? You have heard that from our sacred texts. Wonder, in fact, if our early writers were perhaps under some sort of influence, really, truly, that was what was happening during the time, that people wonder if they were smoking or drinking, and they wrote about their most grand understandings of God in the most confusing. It's the chariot image of God, a God who's part chariot, part animal, wings. Like it's so, it is brilliantly written and takes a lifetime to unpack. So this was in part the impetus, the catalyst for Maimonides to continue writing the Guide for the Perplexed. And after his student went through all these studies of astronomy and math and science and all the Jewish texts, after he took his leave, after he went on to study elsewhere, that was when Maimonides wrote. Here are the three main books with it. Yeah, Marlene, please. You're muted, Marlene.
Okay, so when we heard the rabbi talking about maybe he was under the influence, this is serious speculation that maybe he was taking hallucinogenic drugs?
Not Maimonides. Sorry, not Maimonides. Thank you for the point of clarification. The book of Ezekiel. For those who think that biblical texts were written by human hands, people wonder about the book of Ezekiel.
But they wonder literally whether it was written under the influence of
right there. Our mystics, right? Our mystics are the Kabbalists. Really used all different kinds of tools to become enlightened, right? I use that with the small e, enlightened, right? They really, their depth of knowledge and experience of the infinite, right, came, I know we've talked about this before, you know, this idea of shocheling when you daven, right? Like when you pray, when you go forward, back and forward like this, or side to side. And have you ever seen people do it with such fervor that you think, wow, they're about to take off? Have you seen that look, right? Like they really, no disrespect, right? But they really, it's quite somatic, it's quite bodily, you know, that it actually changes your ability to think, you know, physiologically, your inner ear, right? It changes your balance literally and figuratively, and that there's a different sense of prayer. I don't know if you yourself have experienced this, and even experienced it now that we're at home so much when we're sitting for prayer. I notice my prayer is different sitting than when I'm sitting and standing. My bowing is different. My posture is different. My experience of my prayer is different sitting than it is standing. And standing is different than when I'm standing still or standing and moving, right? So too did our early Kabbalists use movement and certain intoxicants, right? What we would call intoxicants to perhaps transcend to another level of understanding of the divine. Does that make sense, Marlene?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So here, any other questions? It's a good question. Thank you. So here we go into the three main books within the guide. So each one starts with an introduction, and the first one talks about the nature of God and the esoteric ideas. The word sod is secret. So the pshat level is on the surface, and the sod, the secret level, is many levels down, right? And these are in the books of the prophets. Second book talks about philosophy and how, in particular, Aristotle influenced Maimonides, and Maimonides actually writes that if he had found Aristotle's theories compelling enough, he would have integrated them wholly. Instead, they influenced him. If not, he stopped short of saying, Aristotle almost had me. Right, that's kind of what Maimonides said. And then the third major book is on the Merkava, on the chariot imagery from Ezekiel. So you will see in the first chapter. I just want to read this to you. In the first chapter, you'll find subheadings like the homonymity, right? So how we understand things in a very anthropomorphic way, how we understand God in a bodily way, but in fact, it's our misunderstanding of the word likeness and image. He writes extensively about that, right? We think that we understand that we are, when we say B'Tselem Elohim, right, that we are created in the image, Tselem, of God, right? And what the understanding is between image and likeness. So he asks in particular, he says, there's actually a great, I want to read you this. This is one of ways that Maimonides parses things out. He says, we understand that we are created in the image of God, but what does that actually mean? In the physical image of God, when we talk about a God who's got a hand that takes us out from Egypt and a God whose nose burns with anger, do we actually understand it in a physical way? And if so, what does that mean? And if not, what does the anthropomorphism allow us, right? What does that imagery allow us? And this is what he says around the parsing of image and likeness. He says, the term likeness, demut, is a noun derived from the verb dama, to be like. And it too signifies likeness in a respect for notion. For the scriptural dictum, I am like a pelican in the wilderness, does not signify that its author resembled the pelican with regard to its wings and feathers, but that his sadness was like that of the bird. That's kind of the level, that gives us like a little bit of an insight. Does that make sense? Right, this idea that that we understand likeness and image in a certain way that is limited. That is limited, and in fact, not just limited in the way that says you're limited or your language limits you, but much more significantly, it limits our understanding of God and of theology. So this is how he talks about homonymity, about how these words which we have come to understand to mean something actually keep us just looking at the water from the surface level. Goes on to talk about the limit of man's intellect, on metaphysics and physics, on the attribution of senses and sensations of to God, and who God is not and how God is not as part of his description. Second book around philosophy, where he talks about creation and angels and more metaphysical concerns. He talks about the existence and incorporeality of and unity of God and creation, and more about Aristotle. Whole long. I mean, I'm going to show you what each chapter looks like, which you can see. This is if you're interested in Maimonides, this is the best translation of the Guide for the Perplexed that I would recommend. I will put it in the chat box later on. So that is the second chapter around philosophy that talks about creation and angels and prophecy and how they all fit together, whether they are meant to be understood in reality or as allegory, and the difference between metaphor and simile and allegory in our texts, and what ought to be taken literally and what ought not to be taken literally. And then the third chapter is this chapter around the Merkava, around the chariot imagery and messages in the book of Ezekiel, and more teachings from the Mishnah. So we're going to actually do some text study together, but I wanted to give you a sense. Each of the three books has a very significant introduction ahead of it, and then goes on from there. So we are going to look at a lot of text together because it's really the only way to study Maimonides. So I'm hoping that I can have a different volunteer to read each slide, if you will, and we'll stop at the end of each slide to actually look at it. Okay, so I'll ask you to just volunteer, if you would, if someone would volunteer to read this first slide, you can just unmute yourself and start reading.
I have composed this work neither for the common people, nor for the beginners, nor for those who occupy themselves only with the law, as it is handed down, without concerning themselves with its principles. The design of this work is rather to promote the true understanding of the real spirit of the law, to guide those religious persons who, adhering to the Torah, have studied philosophy and are embarrassed by the contradictions between the teachings of philosophy and the literal sense of the Torah. In my larger work, the Mishnah Torah, I have contented myself with briefly stating the principles of our faith and its fundamental truths, together with such hints as approach a clear exposition. In this work, however, I address those who have studied philosophy and have acquired sound knowledge, and who, while firm in religious matters, are perplexed and bewildered on account of the ambiguous and figurative expressions employed in the holy writings.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks. Any initial thoughts to this introduction? You can just unmute yourself. And anything that has caught your attention so far?
Definitely feels like a reconciling or an attempt at reconciling, and in a way, almost a little, not apologist, but like I don't know if that's a word, but apologetic for, if we read something in our texts and on account of these similes and metaphors that are deployed and taking into consideration what we know or discovering through science, they don't ring true to you because you feel like you can't make the two exist in the same universe. Then this is a way to grapple with both at the same time and hold both in your hand.
Yes, absolutely. And the expectation that you're already learned in some of the primary texts, right? Right. Yeah, yes and yes, right. Which is why it makes sense that he wrote this after that significant encounter with that student, right? Right. Yeah. Thanks, Susan. Thank you. Any other initial reactions?
Well, I find it unusual and refreshing that this very learned, in many ways, this person is acknowledging that we might be perplexed.
Right.
Right. And that there's good reason to be.
Right. And that what are seeming inconsistencies actually not only can fit together, but do fit together, right? And he goes on to say in much older language, by the way, if you don't believe that, you're wrong, right? No, there's nothing soft about it, right? He says you're wrong. And he says you're not thinking carefully enough or honestly enough, right? I don't know if you remember some of the early slides, in that first week that talk about his quest for truth, right? I mean, very Aristotelian, right? That he was looking for truth, right? He was looking for truth, and he was looking for truth by way of our texts and our right? Not just our text, but our teaching, right? Our teaching, but yes, right? He is saying, right? And I'll tell you, it's one of my last slides, but I'll tell you, he's he's a genius, right? I mean, he's not just a philosopher and a scholar, right? But we know that he's a doctor, right? So he's got this whole basis. He's a physician for knowing science, right? And his work is in fact criticized by many, certainly in the later 13th and 14th century. He wrote in the 12th, because he was known to put in inconsistencies or mistakes in some of his works to see if you would catch them. And if you don't, you're not meant to be reading his work. He was that kind of guy, right? He was that kind of guy, which I think is fascinating, right? Fascinating. Anything else at all that catches you just from this first slide? We've got a good many more. Okay, let's go on. Would someone like to read this one? You can just unmute, please. Thanks Deborah for reading this one.
To give a full explanation of the mystic passages of the Bible is contrary to the law and to reason. Besides, my knowledge of them is based on reasoning, not on divine inspiration, and is therefore not infallible. It is possible that my view is wrong and that I misunderstand passages referred to. Those, however, for whom this treatise has been composed will, on reflecting on it and thoroughly examining each chapter, obtain a clear insight into all that has been clear and intelligible to me. This is the utmost that can be done in treating this subject so to be useful to all without fully explaining it. You are no doubt aware that the Almighty, desiring to lead us to perfection and to improve our state of society, has revealed to us laws which are to regulate our actions. These laws, however, presuppose an advanced state of intellectual culture. We must first form a conception of the existence of the Creator according to our capabilities. That is, we must have a knowledge of metaphysics, but this discipline can only be approached after the study of physics, for the science of physics borders on metaphysics and must even precede it in the course of our studies, as is clear to all who are familiar with these questions.
Okay, makes sense. Yes, any questions or comments from here? This is just, by the way, these are parts. This is a part of his introduction, right? He's just setting kind of the frame for what his work is going to entail. And any questions from here so far?
I mean, you described him as brilliant, but I'm thinking from the first slide and now this one, he's wrestling with these issues himself. here he is in two worlds, at least two worlds, and he's been trying to figure it out himself. So this is his way of explaining his understanding, recognizing that there may be other ideas that he's been wrestling and trying to figure it out himself, I think.
Absolutely.
I'm not
Absolutely.
getting that he's like this divine person who has all this knowledge and he's imparting it. He's like working through it too, trying to figure it out.
He doesn't claim himself to be, but even though, right, like we read also one of the first slides, right, that would say, from Moses to Moses, there was never a Moses like this one, right? That, I don't know if you remember that slide from that first week, right? But he doesn't call himself, he's not a self-proclaimed prophet, right? He's a sage, right? He's a sage by our standards, but he was a philosopher by his own, right? He was a philosopher and he was a Jew. Right? He was a Jew living in countries where Islam was the predominant culture and where he was a scientist on top of being a scholar and a philosopher. But yes, he is very much, by way even just of his introduction, Toby, as you say, looking at how to reconcile or balance or understand science and right, physics and metaphysics together, or science and faith, together, because for him, they are not at odds. They are not at odds. This is the beginning of our trying to understand his approach. Right?
Yeah, that's why it appeals to me, because it's not either or. It's not so simple. It's like, how do we put it together? How do we make sense of it in a whole way?
Thank you. Thank you. Anything else at all before we go to the next one?
I'm struck by, in for me, fairly recent times, learning about scientists who had been just with science, but as the more they learned, the deeper they went as scientists, they get to that edge where there has to be something else, so that they have become, they don't see the dichotomy between science and faith. But to me, it's a beautiful kind of journey there that happens.
Yeah, right. And the rigor of being a scientist, right? Of being a critical thinker without any value attached to it, right? I'm not saying critical thinker as a good or a bad thing, but being a systematic, comprehensive thinker in this way, how those, for him, must be one and the same, right? That you must be both person of faith and systematic and thorough in your thinking. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Let's go on to the next one. Does someone want to continue with this one?
I will. Do not imagine that these most difficult problems can be thoroughly understood by any one of us. This is not the case. At times, the truth shines so brilliantly that we perceive it as clear as day. Our nature and habit then draw a veil over our perception, and we return to darkness, almost as dense as before. We are like those who, though beholding frequent flashes of lightning, still find ourselves in the thickest darkness of the night. On some of the lightning flashes in rapid succession, and they seem to be in continuous light, and their night is as clear as the day. This was the degree of prophetic excellence attained by Moses, the greatest prophets, to whom God said, "But as for thee, stand thou here by me, and of whom it is written, the skin of his face shone," etc. Some perceive the prophetic flash at long intervals. This is the degree of most prophets. By others, only once during the whole night is a flash of lightning perceived. This is the case with those of whom we are informed. They prophesied and did not prophesy again. There are some whom the flashes of light appear with varying intervals. Others are in the condition of men whose darkness is illumined not by lightning, but by some kind of crystal or similar stone or other substances that possess the property of shining during the night. And to them, even the small amount of light is not continuous, but now it shines and now it vanishes, as if it were the flame of the rotating sword. Wow.
Wow, right? Wow. It's so beautifully and powerfully written and not easy to read. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And what do you take from that? What do you, it's beautiful imagery, isn't it? It's very very powerful. What do you take from that? What's he saying? What's he saying?
So I assume he's saying that we're, as humans, we're only capable of getting snatches, and trying to fill in big empty pieces to get a full understanding.
Does anybody else read it any differently?
Yeah, I wonder if he's saying that different people have different levels of understanding. Some see the whole picture, some see only parts of it.
And go ahead, Les, go ahead.
I don't know whether he places a value on those that see the whole picture, that they have more understanding, they're better people. I'm beginning to think he's a little elitist in this, but maybe not.
He points also to this idea of how we habituate ourselves to actually blocking out the that information, right? That knowledge, right? That he uses the term of lightning, right? But our nature and habit can draw a veil over our perception, and we return to darkness, right? That it's there. That you can understand the ways of the grand ways of the world and of God and of being in relationship to God, if only you don't get in your own way, right? That we actually, it's a very, very prevalent theme in Judaism, that we have klipot, right? That we have these shells that keep us from experiencing all that is, right? All God, right? Right. That we actually, we build and we build and we build things that actually keep us from this knowledge, this truth, understanding, right? So Les, it's interesting, you see it as somewhat elitist. You read it as elitist? Is that right?
A little bit. I mean, I'm reading it, at least the way it may be translated, that certain people don't have the capability of doing things. I think maybe what you're saying is if we strip off the outer shells, that maybe everyone can understand. Maybe both are right. But this thing about having shells that protect us from knowledge, I think, goes back to taking drugs and things to open up the shells, to open us to the greater truth. That might lead into that. I don't know.
I don't think they protect us, by the way. I don't know if that was the word that you meant. I don't think they protect us from knowledge. I think they actually impede us.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
They are actually seen as a barrier, and it's less so. I don't want to my comment about the intoxicants actually was around the writing of the book of Ezekiel, not Maimonides' work. I want to be clear to say that is speculation about the book of Ezekiel, and other mystical texts, not Rambam. That's not what people say about Rambam. Right? Rambam is talking about what are the things, are those flashes of lightning that Toby just read about, are they happening all the time? And we're missing them and still in darkness? Or are they clear as day? Or is it only meant, as you say, Les, is it only meant really for Moses, right? And for our prophets? He writes an entire chapter on the prophets, right? An entire very detailed chapter on the prophets, right? So right, how do we understand our access to this? What needs to happen for that? Marlene, go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to understand about the crystal and stone, and I'm wondering if it seems to me that when there's a flash of lightning, we have no control over it. But if it's an actual object like a crystal or a stone or a sword even, we can manipulate it, or maybe we have some control over how much light we allow to exist or shine upon us. I'm not sure if that's what that's about at all, but I was trying to understand this crystal stone thing.
What do people think? You're onto a very important piece. What do people think that crystal or stone might be a reference to?
Yeah. Oh, I was wondering whether that could be a false truth or a false light. And people think it's the truth, but it really isn't.
Yes. Yes. In particular, what, Marcia? What do we read in Torah study almost every week? What is there a warning against?
False prophets?
Yes. Oh, and not only false prophets, but idolatry, right? Idolatry in particular. And you think about where he's living, right? He's living in places where the predominant culture is not Jewish, right? It's not Jewish, and where idolatry is a normal part of practice, right? Whether a Christian or Muslim, not so much, but Christian worship for sure, right? Right, where idolatry was the prohibition within the Jewish community, right? And that it's right, and this goes back to we're going to look some more at it at his concept of matter, right? Of matter and what what our temple cult practices were around ritually making offerings versus praying to something that's shiny, right? Is kind of what he's pointing to here, right? A crystal, no disrespect, right? But something that has something that has a shine to it, that illumines in a way that isn't substantive, that isn't true, right? That is where he gets to ultimately, right? So March, yes, March, I think that's and Marlene probably what he means by this passage as well. Yeah.
Are you saying the crystals and stone are idols that he's speaking of?
I believe so. Yeah. Others are in the condition of right, whose darkness is illumined not by lightning, but by some kind of crystal or similar stone or other substance that possess the property of shining during the night, right? Just during the night, but nothing beyond that, as if it were the flame on the rotating sword, right? That advantages, right? That there's right. Yeah. Go ahead.
But shining during the night could also be a metaphor for ignorance. It shows you light during ignorance. And if flashes of light from the Torah you get, I mean, you don't have to understand the whole Torah. You can understand parts of it and get ideas from it. You could also read it that way, or could you not?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe that's what he is offering as well. That's that it's constant, and it depends on our
insight at the moment, I would say.
Our insight in the moment, going back to those veils, right, or those habits that might stand in the way from our seeing, broad sense of the word, right, understanding those insights versus something that is man-made, right? Because he subscribes to a Torah that is not man. Let's go on a little bit. It gives us a little bit more in here. A short one. Someone want to read that? Someone who hasn't read yet and who wants to read something short?
I can do it. All the great evils which men cause to each other because of certain intentions, desires, opinions, or religious principles are likewise due to non-existence because they originate in ignorance, which is absence of wisdom. If men possess wisdom, which stands in the same relationship to the form of man as the sight to the eye, they would not cause any injury to themselves or to others. For the knowledge of the truth removes hatred and quarrels and prevents mutual injuries.
Mm-hmm. I see faces going, tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah.
And
Well,
a goal, an ideal. That's the feeling I had.
That it's aspirational, this text?
Yes.
Well, he's saying that if you have knowledge, it will do good things. That's a pretty positive point of view of mankind, I guess, unless he means knowledge as because they originate in ignorance. Is that ignorance being a lack of faith in God, or a knowledge of science in general? I don't know what she's talking about here.
Right, because what comes after the comment is absence of wisdom, right? Which it doesn't, right? Is that wisdom text wisdom? Is it Is it science wisdom? Is it science and tech, right? What is he saying? Just by way of introduction, right? That's where we don't have understanding quite yet. No pun intended, right?
I thought this passage was pretty amazing because, I mean, to me, he's saying, if we do possess wisdom, not sure yet what exactly that is, but people would no longer hurt each other and hatred would not exist. And that's pretty extremely hopeful to me. And also what impressed me was the phrase where wisdom to a man is like sight is to the eye. I mean, that's very, very interesting. It's like the, I don't know, but like the purpose of a person is to have wisdom, and that gives power of sight and insight. And anyway, I found this passage really, really powerful.
It is, right. He is claiming not that you need to have read a certain amount or passed through certain tests, right? Literally, like, tests like our kids take, right? But that it is right there. And if you have studied it, right, if you have learned those truths, both scientific and faith, you will understand, right, what is right and wrong, and hurt will be gone, right? And hatred will be gone. You will understand by virtue of this revelation, not God revelate, well, yeah, God revelation, right? That you will understand, right? How it is right for us to be with one another.
The thing is, though, that I'm sort of thinking about is this whole idea of knowledge of the truth, as if there is one way of looking at things. And if we all can get on the same page, so to speak, that's probably very simplistic, that then things will be better. But where does interpretation come in? Different cultures, different perspectives I mean, just because your truth might be different than mine, it doesn't mean that we're not wise, that we can't find a way to be together, to have a moral life and a good world by appreciating that sometimes we understand things differently. I have a very good friend now I've gotten to know over the last few years from India. She has multiple gods, and I'm learning about her multiple gods and trying to figure out how that fits in with the idea of the one God. And we do find it, we understand the world in different ways, but I think she particularly is a very wise person. So this seems to me like I guess what I'm trying to say, this seems to me like there's one truth, this a contextual one truth, and where does interpretation and different perspectives come in? I'm not clear about that.
It's so funny, Toby, that you're saying that. I had one of my closest friends and another is a sojourner. She is a devout Christian, and there are a handful of places where we see things otherwise. But she is by far and away one of the people who is the most nourishing for me spiritually. Right? I mean, I see from your faces, I'm not alone in that. Right? There are her approach, her truth, even when, and maybe especially when it doesn't align with mine, causes me to think much more expansively, right? Invites me, I guess, to think much more expansively about the places where we align, the places where we differ, and where I think maybe they differ, but maybe don't.
Yeah.
Right?
But in there is trying to we come to understand or gain insight from each other, as opposed to trying to come to one truth. It's
Right.
like we exist together, not at odds, not in conflict, but with insight and understanding that comes from both. I'm not sure.
I agreed. And he's speaking from a minority opinion, right? He's speaking as a Jew in Muslim countries, right? Joyce, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Joyce, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that the paths are different, the means are different to come to the truth, but that it's to me that there are truths, or there is truth that transcends and all of that going deeply enough into whatever the faith is, when we come to a place that seems like it's where what Maimonides is saying, desiring to lead us to perfection, that kind of that's what God is. That this sounds arrogant, you know. I don't know that I know that, but that image of perfection, of to be that we can, how we can be perfect ourselves, and to see the oneness of everything, and that if we are really in tune with that, then how can you hate, you know?
And at the same time, I hear, right, Toby mentioned it as well, right? It's a very fine kind of membrane between what we're using the term truths, or some people would say universal truths, or right, things like that, and superiority or chosenness, or right, and even, you know, even and especially amongst us as Jews, right, right, how we understand that very fine space that Maimonides is inviting us to shed a light on, right, what that looks like. That looks like. Marlene, and then I see some other hands. Go ahead.
Well, a phrase that's popping out to me right now in this discussion, especially starting with Toby, where it says ignorance, which is the absence of wisdom. Now, I think of ignorance as, sometimes we say that it's the absence of knowledge. And I think the difference, to me, the knowledge might be learning all the rules and teachings, and wisdom is using a moral sense with, I don't know if this is true, but this is what I'm thinking, using a moral sense of applying those rules in the way that we become moral and not hurting others. And that maybe this, what we're talking about as coming together from different faith systems, that at the top of the whatever is wisdom, that we get to from different tenets, different rules, different languages, but there's something that's wisdom that has to do with, to me, living a good life and treating others well.
And yes, how he looks at things that are irrefutable. That's what I was looking for. Irrefutable, right? Nature, right? Things in nature, right? Until you alter it, right? But things in nature that are irrefutable across, right? We might say as progressives, right? Across faith lines, right? But things that you can't deny, and science that you can't deny. And then where that intersects with understanding existentially how the world works, right? How it can only work is what he's positing, right? That's what he's positing. There was another, and I saw another hand up, and just unmute yourself. Yeah, Susan, please go ahead.
This is from a thought I had much earlier, but when he writes that wisdom, which stands in the same relation to the form of man as the sight to the eye, I found that kind of a confusing analogy to make, because basically if you have rods and cones and the right hookups as far as your nerves are concerned, and your brain, the part of the brain that, you know, sees and stuff, like you open your eye, if there's light out there and there are forms out there, the light's going to reflect it, it's going to enter your eye and go to your brain, and you're going to see something. But this wisdom, because he's saying if men possessed wisdom, so clearly he doesn't think certainly all men possess wisdom or all people possess wisdom. This doesn't seem like such a passive thing, right? Like if wisdom is somehow like sight to the, like brain sight, right? Not eyesight, but brain sight. How come it's not so easy as just standing there? How come we're not just sort of bathed in it, you know? So I just thought that was an interesting way to phrase it, because to me, it seems like a kind of different process.
Yeah, I'm thinking, right, how many times do we not see the things that are right in front of us, literally or figuratively, right? Right. You know, is that maybe what he's addressing? Right? It's an excellent point you bring up. Right?
In that case, usually that's probably because you're bombarded, because there is so much out there, right? So it's like a competition. How many stimuli can you attend to simultaneously? You have to be selective. And so in that way, I feel like wisdom kind of relates to Toby's point about there potentially being different wisdoms that come out of different cultures, or are having the wisdom to appreciate the different things of value from different cultures. But maybe it is a case of there's so much competition in terms of like, what is wisdom? And how do you be selective and you know, attune yourself to what he sees as truth. I don't know.
And what are the things that stand in the way? Right, he uses the imagery of a veil, right? What's the veil that maybe obscures that? What are the klipot, right? What are the shells that keep us from, right? There's a whole bunch of different metaphors within Judaism for what stands in our way. What stands in our way, right? That's in part, and this is just his introduction, right? That's in part what he's addressing. Was there one more hand?
Yes, you know, I'm reading it as wisdom, as one wisdom, the truth, not not a broad wisdom. In other words, if you see things the way I see them, then the scales will fall from your eyes. You'll see the truth as I see the truth. Maybe I'm being a little too narrow in that, but I think I'm getting the sense that he sees only one wisdom and one way, one truth, and that if you see it my way, then we wouldn't be arguing anymore.
And he was a follower and a student, right, of Aristotle's work.
Yeah.
Right. That's what gives me pause less, right? He was our guy for sure. He's like one of our most prominent. He and Rashi. Those are the two that we read most often, right? Rambam and Rashi. So he's our guy in the Jewish community. But yeah, he was heavily influenced not just by Aristotle, but by so many of the thinkers, the Greek thinkers and the Muslim thinkers to whom he was exposed. Let's go on a little bit. I see that we only have 7 minutes left and like 15 more slides. So let's go on a little bit. This is a passage that says, an ignorant man believes that the whole universe only exists for him as if nothing else required any consideration. If therefore anything happens to him contrary to his expectation, he at once concludes that the whole universe is evil. If, however, he would take into consideration the whole universe, form an idea of it, and comprehend what a small portion he is of the universe, he will find truth. There are many passages in the books of prophets that express this same idea, and he quotes from Psalms, right? Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow. I'll ask you, just unmute yourself if you have a comment or a thought or a question about this. I see smiles, which I'm going to take as a good sign. So let's go on. Does someone want to read this next one?
This is our theory, or that of our law. The theory of man's perfectly free will is one of the fundamental principles of the law of our teacher Moses and of those who follow the law. According to this principle, man does what is in his power to do by his nature, his choice, and his will, and his action is not due to any faculty created for the purpose. All species of irrational animals likewise move by their own free will. This is the will of God. That is to say, it is due to the external divine with all living beings.
Eternal. I got to just correct that one. Eternal, not external divine. Though I like your mistake. But the eternal divine. Go ahead.
Eternal divine will that all living beings should move freely and that man should have the power to act according to his will or choice within the limits of his capacity. The strange and wonderful book of Job treats the same subject as we are discussing. Its contents are a fiction, conceived for the purpose of explaining the different opinions which people hold of divine providence. This fiction, however, in so far different from other fictions that it includes profound ideas and great mysteries, removes grave doubts, and reveals the most important truths, I will discuss it as fully as possible, and I will tell you the words of our sages that suggested to me the explanation of this great poem.
What do we have? Thank you. What do we have here? His next category in his introduction, after we talked about truths. Yeah, go ahead.
Is this predestination and free will? I mean, that's the big thing about, if there is a God and we have free will, that's a problem. And if there's a God and we have predestination, that's a problem for us. So it sounds like he's going to go into that.
Tell me where you're getting you had me until it's a problem, but tell me where you get to it's a problem.
What, predestination and free will?
Free will and it's a problem. I'll start with that one.
Well, if God knows everything is going to happen, that would be predestination. So therefore we have no free will. If we have free will, then God is not all powerful. Now you can work around that, I guess, and that becomes a whole book, a whole life. You know, how do we
God has
put
the
these
power
two
to
things
give
together?
and
So your point to free will is critical, not just for Maimonides, but within Judaism, right? What does Judaism teach about free will? What does Maimonides teach about free? Do you know what Maimonides teaches about free will? Are we imbued with free will?
I believe we are,
Yeah.
but in some minds that means that we have the power and God doesn't have complete power.
Does it? I'm wondering what others think.
God gave us that power.
Well,
Say again.
God gave us the power of free will, yes, but we become a little circular after a while in this.
Yeah, nice.
I would venture to say more than circular. Yes. Yes, I have like I have a labyrinth in my head, right? But yes, right? But yes and no. Yes and no, right? There are those, and Maimonides among them, who are very clear about God's omniscience, God's omnipotence, and free will, Yeah, there was a hand. Go ahead, Toby. Were you unmuted? No, okay.
No, I'm still thinking this part.
Okay, I'm going to go on just for a second, just so that we can see. Hold on one second. I'm going to move past this one.
Uh-huh.
Mm.
Do you want to read this one? I think this is the one that we just read. We read that one. Hold on. Here, let me give you this one. This is a beautiful piece that helps in part with our understanding. It's the Adam and Eve story, right? Through the intellect, man distinguishes between the true and the false. This faculty Adam possessed perfectly and completely. The right and the wrong are terms employed in the science of apparent truths, morals, not in that of necessary truths, as, for example, it's not correct to say, in reference to the proposition, the heavens are spherical and it is good, or to declare the assertion that the earth is flat to be bad, but we say of the one it is true, of the other it is false. Similarly, our language expresses the idea of true and false by the terms emet and cheker, of the morally right and the morally wrong by tov and ra. Thus, it is the function of the intellect to discriminate between the true and the false, a distinction which is applicable to all objects of intellectual perception. When Adam was yet in a state of innocence, he was guided solely by reflection and reason, right? So we understand, right, that he knew true and false. He didn't yet know good and bad, right? Right, does that make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? I hope, yes. And any questions just before we finish up? Any questions before we kind of wrap things up on this? You can see how it makes sense for him, right? To not care about the judgment of things until you know the truthiness of things, right?
So there was good and bad, but he didn't know it. Is that what he's saying? Or there was not good and bad? Which is
he saying?
I'm hearing that there was good and bad, but he did not know about the whole idea of good and bad.
Or did he not know yet?
Yeah, not know yet, but it already existed.
Here, just by way, I see time is running. So here, by way of concluding, right? This is what he teaches, right? That it is an established fact that species have no existence except in our own minds. This is where this is where it all happens, right? That species and other classes are merely ideas formed in our minds, whilst everything in real existence is an individual object or an aggregate of individual objects. right? That this is what happens in our mind isn't what happens in real life, and that the bridge between those is where we ought to be, right? And this is his chapter where he right? We have looked at this passage as well, right? And that an ignorant man believes that the whole universe only exists for him, right? We read this passage, right? And to know our place within it all is critical, right? And here is, we'll finish with this, right? That the idea of the unity of God, that it has been demonstrated by proof that the whole existing world is one organic body, all parts of which are connected together, right? The divine influence that actually gives existence. The concluding words of this verse, in thy light we see light, express exactly what we said, namely that by the influence of the intellect, which emanates from God, interesting, right? We haven't covered that yet. We become wise. By it, we are guided and enabled to comprehend the active intellect. The principle in the highest function is performed when the senses are at rest and pause in their action, for then it receives to some extent divine inspiration in the measure as it is predisposed for this influence. We've explained there that it is the fundamental principle of our religion, namely that God is absolutely one, that nothing combines with God. That is to say, there is no eternal thing besides God, right? That you cannot, right? You cannot actually understand what is truth until you understand what is, your relationship to what is, and how you ought to examine, how we ought to examine that. So cannot do Maimonides in 360 minute classes or 4. Hopefully we'll find out a last date to reconnect. But tell me, what are you thinking so far about Maimonides, those of you who studied his works and those who are studying him anew? What does it leave you wondering about, or frustrated by, or curious about?
Well, it leaves me curious is about how we're going to survive as a country, because no one is listening to what Maimonides had to say. We are dealing with some 30 million people or so who don't look at the obvious existing physical truth and therefore can't make judgments. Shouldn't be making judgments, that is.
Yeah.
I'm left from this session really thinking about what is wisdom, what's the nature of wisdom, and also re-intrigued about free will and predestination. To be continued.
To be continued, yeah. I'm hoping to find a secure date that works for everybody. If you want to do one last class together to kind of bring together the very disparate pieces, seemingly, right? Yeah. Free will is huge within Jewish thought. Huge.
I thought one of these something that you got to at the very end, and I feel like I didn't spend enough time on it, but the categorization, the categories existing in our heads run into me a lot of Rabbi Garraway's talk and Aristotle and the world of forms. It definitely felt like there was some connection there. So
absolutely. Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for a quick bite of lunch together, right? Of thought lunch together, and to be continued. So we will, like I say, not meet next Monday. That's Shavuot. Join us, please, if you're able, for Shavuot services, both Erev Shavuot services on Sunday night in our confirmation class, and then Monday morning Shavuot and Yizkor as well. So, but Shabbat in between, and I'll keep the chat to see who is available when. Please let me know if May 19th, that's a Wednesday, week from this Wednesday, works at noontime for the 4th